In a raw frontier landscape scarred by dust storms and broken promises, a desperate young woman named Evelyn McAllister takes one final chance at hope, a mail-order marriage to a man she's never met. But her dream of escape quickly curdles into terror when she meets her cruel husband in the remote mountains of the Dakota Territory. Chased through the wild by his hired guns, her every heartbeat echoes with the thunder of hooves closing in. Amid twisting trails and perilous ravines, she clings to life as dawn breaks on an unlikely ally, a Sioux warrior who could be her only path to survival and redemption. In the spring of 1876, Evelyn McAllister lived on the outskirts of New York City. She was 23 years old, her golden brown hair almost always hidden beneath a bonnet, and her spirit weighed down by the relentless claustrophobia of poverty. The suffocating air of industrialized streets mingled with coal dust crowding people into cramped tenements. Evelyn's parents had died of illness, her father from a lung infection after years of labor at the docks, and her mother from heartbreak not long after. Evelyn made a meager living as a seamstress, spending long hours in a dimly lit shop, stitching and hemming while her eyes burned and her fingers numbed from pricks of the needle. Every night she returned to a boarding house run by an older widow named Mrs. Gladstone, who charged half of her wages in rent. It was a bleak existence overshadowed by the looming dread that she would never climb out of these hardships. One fateful afternoon, as she trudged home through Manhattan's Lower East Side, she passed by a modest bakery owned by the Thompson family. Tacked to a nearby lamppost was a small advertisement that drew her attention like a magnet. Wanted a refined lady of good character to be a mail-order bride. Must be willing to relocate to the Dakota Territory. Generous monthly allowance guaranteed. Contact Mr. Conrad Gallagher, Co. The White Buffalo Saloon, Deadwood. Evelyn paused, reading the text over and over. A swirl of conflicting emotions raged inside her. The promise of a better life called out to her, but fear of the unknown was no less potent. Tales of the West filtered back east through newspaper reports of gold rush booms, lawlessness, and savage frontier justice. Yet she weighed her present desperation against the uncertain possibility of Western redemption. That same evening, she discussed the advertisement with Mrs. Gladstone, who scoffed at the notion of crossing the country to live on the frontier. However, something about the ad embedded itself deep in Evelyn's mind. She wrote a letter to Mr. Conrad Gallagher, half disbelieving she would ever receive a response. In her letter, she recounted her humble upbringing, her capacity for hard work, and her dreams of establishing a family and a stable home. She folded the parchment neatly and sent it, half hoping it might find its way lost among the thousands of letters traveling west. To her astonishment, 2 weeks later, a letter arrived on Mrs. Gladstone's worn-out doormat. It was crisp, scrawled in a fine script, bearing the seal of a notary in Deadwood. Mr. Gallagher welcomed the possibility of their union, praising her candor and promising that she would have a comfortable life on a spacious ranch. He described the Dakota sky as a vast ocean of color and the mountains like guardians keeping watch. Attached was a train ticket to Cheyenne, along with a stagecoach pass to Deadwood. No one had ever done anything so extravagant for Evelyn. The gesture swept away her doubts, at least for the moment. Within a week, she packed her few belongings and set out for the wild frontier, heedless of the storms awaiting her. Several jolting days by train and stagecoach, later Evelyn stepped onto the dusty streets of Deadwood, a bustling gold rush town, where tent saloons and ramshackle buildings fought for space, with fancy hotels built by those who struck it rich. The stench of horse manure and sweaty men lingered in the muggy air. Carts laden with mining equipment rumbled past, and an endless throng of prospectors, gamblers, and fortune-seekers roamed the thoroughfare. Deadwood was no polished eastern city. Here, arguments erupted into fistfights over a single game of poker, and fortunes were won or lost in a single evening. Evelyn's heart pounded as she tried to keep her composure in this chaotic new world. She clutched her small travel bag, scanning the bustling crowds for her supposed fiancé. A tall, clean-shaven man in a well-tailored suit emerged from behind a horse-drawn wagon. "You must be Miss McAllister," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Conrad Gallagher." He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with slicked-back dark hair and keen grey eyes. Yet something about his manner, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, or the way his eyes flicked around nervously, unsettled her. Still, she reminded herself that he had paid for her passage and deserved her gratitude. Conrad escorted her to the White Buffalo Saloon, one of the more respectable establishments in town. Inside, he introduced her to some of his acquaintances, a lanky man named Silas Merton, who served as the saloon's bartender, and a flamboyantly dressed gambler known only as Black Jack Bailey. Over a modest supper, Evelyn carefully observed Conrad's behavior. He spoke graciously at first, describing his ranch at the base of the Black Hills, the rolling meadows where they kept horses, and the distant view of the mountains. He boasted of his business ventures, partnerships with traveling merchants and mines. The more he talked, the more he painted a portrait of a future that might have been plucked from her deepest dreams. A home in the wide, open spaces. A chance to watch the sun set behind a horizon unobscured by tall, grimy buildings. Yet between bragging about his wealth and complaining about Deadwood's riffraff, there was a coldness in his tone. When Evelyn mentioned the possibility of the local tribes, particularly the Sioux, Conrad's face darkened. He spat out a curse, condemning them as savages who opposed their rightful claim to the land. The sudden venom in his voice shook Evelyn to the core. Nevertheless, she had few options. She was alone in a strange and lawless territory, with barely any money of her own. After dinner, Conrad placed a small box in front of her, containing a modest silver ring. "I can't offer you a grand wedding," he said, "but I can give you a decent life. Will you be my wife?" Evelyn, trembling with uncertainty, managed a nod. She slipped the ring onto her finger, swallowing the unease building like a storm in her chest. Within hours they were wed by the justice of the peace. By dawn the next day, she found herself in a rickety wagon rattling down a winding road, leaving Deadwood behind for the promise and peril of an unknown future. The Gallagher Ranch sat at the edge of a fertile valley, flanked by granite peaks. The main house was a decent if modest wooden structure with a wide porch. A separate bunkhouse accommodated 2 ranch hands, Javier and young Mason, who worked with Conrad to manage the horses and the few head of cattle they owned. Evelyn woke each morning to the pale light of dawn, her mind stirring with cautious optimism. Though the ranch was smaller than Conrad had implied, it was still more land than she had ever imagined. Sometimes she would stand on the porch enthralled by the panoramic sweep of open sky. The fresh scent of pine on the mountain breeze was a daily reminder of the distance she had traveled from her old life. Her chores included preparing meals, mending torn clothes, and keeping the ranch house in order. Occasionally she rode out with Conrad to check on the pastures. On those rare rides, the land revealed its quiet majesty, slender streams carving through lush grasslands, forests bristling with evergreen pines and rocky outcrops inhabited by hawks. But these fleeting moments of wonder were overshadowed by the growing discomfort she felt around her new husband. Within the first week, Conrad had shown two vastly different sides of himself. Around the ranch hands or business associates, he was amiable, almost jocular, laughing at their jokes and praising their hard work. But behind closed doors, a darker persona emerged. He would snap at Evelyn for the smallest perceived mistake, a meal too salty, a shirt not folded to his liking. When she tried to question him about some finances or ranch affairs, he grew tense, warning her to stay in her place. Late one afternoon, Silas Merton, the lanky bartender from Deadwood, arrived. He was accompanied by another man named Ezekiel Proctor, a self-proclaimed mountain scout with a menacing air. Evelyn noticed the hush that fell over the ranch hands, the shared looks of unease that passed between Javier and Mason. She eavesdropped from behind the half-open door as they spoke. Conrad mentioned something about mining stakes and protection from marauding tribes. Their voices dropped to hushed tones, and Silas shot an occasional glance toward the house. As the men left, they seemed jubilant, while Conrad looked more determined. That night, Conrad drank more whiskey than usual, and his temper flared like a lit fuse. Evelyn timidly asked if anything was wrong, and he answered by hurling a plate against the wall, the sound of shattering pottery echoing through the small cabin. In a terrifying whisper, he told her never to pry into his affairs again. Evelyn realized with a sinking heart that her new husband was not just a landowner or rancher, but a man deeply involved in dangerous dealings. The biting remarks and unpredictable outbursts of anger hinted at something more sinister beneath the surface. She had come all this way hoping for salvation, and discovered instead that she might have leaped from one set of hardships into something far worse. That night, as she lay awake listening to the wind moaning over the mountains, she felt truly alone for the first time in her life. Dread became Evelyn's constant companion. She flinched at every slammed door, every scowl crossing Conrad's face. Small kindnesses he had shown early on dwindled, replaced by a scathing cruelty that lurked in every corner of the house. She tried to appease him, cooking his favorite dishes, avoiding topics that triggered his temper. But nothing seemed to stop the slow, sinister unveiling of his nature. One evening after he returned from a trip to Deadwood with Ezekiel Proctor, Conrad's rage escalated beyond words. He slapped Evelyn across the face for answering his question too slowly. Her cheek burned, her spirit flinched. Cowering in her cramped bedroom that night, she realized she could no longer hope to mend this situation. She had to leave, no matter the cost. The next morning, she resolved to slip away. Evelyn packed what few possessions she could fit into a small satchel, a spare dress, a shawl, and a modest sum of money she had been secretly setting aside from the household funds. She knew she had to move swiftly and quietly. Javier and Mason had left at dawn to gather supplies in a nearby town, so the ranch was nearly empty. As fate would have it, however, Conrad rode back into the yard unexpectedly. He caught sight of her creeping from the house, satchel in hand. His face twisted into an incredulous snarl. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. Fear slammed into her, but she forced herself to appear calm. "I was going to gather flowers," she lied, voice unsteady to decorate the table. She gestured feebly toward a meadow behind the house. "Liar." He dismounted, boots crunching on gravel as he stalked closer. His eyes flicked to her satchel. "You think I'm an idiot? You're trying to leave me." Before she could react, Conrad lunged and tore the satchel from her grip. Clothes spilled onto the dirt. In a rage, he grabbed her by the arm, dragging her back into the house. She let out a sharp cry, struggling to break free. Once inside, he hurled her against a chair. The impact was enough to make her vision blur. "You ungrateful wretch!" he hissed, bending close, his hot breath on her face. "I brought you here, gave you a better life. You don't get to leave." Terror mingled with fury in Evelyn's heart. She glared up at him, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to speak, to fling accusations about the lies he'd told, the violence he carried within him. But fear choked her voice. He stormed out to the barn after a final shove, muttering curses. Evelyn realized with a sickening jolt that escaping would not be simple. Conrad was watchful, suspicious, and likely capable of far worse violence. Yet she clung to one resolve: she would not remain under his brutal thumb. If she was to survive, she would have to make a plan more cunning, more daring than a hurried slip into the wilderness. Over the following weeks, tension enveloped the ranch like a suffocating fog. Conrad's menacing unpredictability kept Evelyn constantly on edge. She went about her chores in silence, avoiding eye contact and any conversation that might spark his temper. The bruises on her arms, a silent testament to his rage, forced her to wear long sleeves even in the day's heat. One afternoon, she was kneading dough in the kitchen when Javier quietly stepped inside, removing his dusty hat. The older ranch hand was in his mid-40s, graying at the temples, with deep-set eyes that spoke of hard-won wisdom. He had always been respectful and kept a gentle distance, but that day he appeared nervous. He glanced around to ensure Conrad wasn't within earshot. "Senora," he began in a hushed tone, "I've seen how he treats you." He lowered his eyes as if ashamed to acknowledge the abuse. "I don't like it. Mason neither. But Conrad, he's dangerous. He has powerful friends." Evelyn paused her work, kneading hands trembling. She had suspected for some time that Javier had noticed her predicament, but she never dared speak openly for fear of Conrad's retribution. "I'm managing," she said softly, not fooling either of them. Javier hesitated, then spoke again. "Listen carefully. I heard Conrad talking to Ezekiel Proctor. They have some plan, a big job near the mountains. Something about gold in Sioux territory. They mean to drive the Sioux out, or worse." A ghost of fear flickered in Javier's eyes. "It'll bring trouble, and it's not just them. A group of rough men from Deadwood are in on it too. Soldiers might turn a blind eye because of bribes." A chill coiled in Evelyn's stomach. She had guessed Conrad was involved in murky dealings, but this sounded worse than she could have imagined: armed aggression against local tribes. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered, checking the hallway in case Conrad was nearby. "Because once they do it, the Sioux will retaliate. Blood on both sides. And Conrad, he hates them. The rage I see in him every day. It's a monster growing." Javier glanced at her bruises, voice trembling with empathy. "You need to get out of here. I'm going to leave too, but I can't just run off. He owes me wages, and Mason is only a boy. I can't abandon him. But you have no reason to stay." Evelyn felt a wave of gratitude. In this bleak place, Javier was risking his own safety to warn her. "Thank you," she managed. "I've tried." He caught me. He's always watching. Javier lowered his voice to a breath. "Conrad and Ezekiel will be gone for 2 days later this week. They're heading to Deadwood." "If you're going to leave..." "That's when..." Evelyn's heart pounded. This might be the window of escape she had prayed for, yet fear gnawed at her, for she knew the wrath she would face if caught again. Still, she could not ignore this chance. As Javier walked quietly away, She repeated his words in her mind, fueling her courage. If there was a way to flee the ranch and outrun Conrad, she would find it. 3 days later, the opportunity arrived on a cold morning. Conrad saddled up alongside Ezekiel Proctor and rode off without much fanfare, carrying a rifle slung over his shoulder and a grim set to his jaw. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, heart hammering, as their horses trotted out of sight beyond the ridgeline. Time was short. She hurried to gather a small stash of bread, dried jerky, and a canteen of water. She wore practical boots, knowing she might have to navigate rough terrain. Silently, she whispered gratitude to Javier, who had hidden a saddlebag with supplies beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. She stuffed in a few personal items, her mother's locket, a brush, a spare skirt, and then slipped outside, scanning the horizon for signs of returning riders. Mason was tending to the horses. The boy glanced at her with wide, knowing eyes. "Good luck, ma'am," he said in a hushed tone. "I'll keep quiet till you're gone." Her heart warmed at the gesture, but she had no time to linger. She saddled a mare named Pearl. Quietly leading the horse past the main gate, she mounted and spurred Pearl into a brisk trot across the open plain. The ranch grew smaller behind her, and the freedom of the wide land spread out before her, tempered only by the fear that Conrad or Ezekiel might catch wind of her escape. Instead of taking the main trail to Deadwood, she headed toward the shadow of the Black Hills, hoping the rugged terrain would cover her tracks. Gusts of wind whipped her hair free from its tie, stinging her cheeks with dust. The mountains loomed like silent guardians, their granite faces reflecting the midday sun. By late afternoon, she arrived at the foothills. Exhaustion tugged at her, but she pressed on, weaving through narrow passes and dense pine forests. Her senses were on high alert for any sign of pursuit. Every snap of a twig felt like a thunderclap in her mind. She found a secluded hollow near a trickling creek and decided to make camp. As dusk descended, Evelyn tethered Pearl to a sturdy pine and unrolled a thin blanket near the creek's bank. The forest was alive with nocturnal whispers, owls hooting, insects churring a distant wolf's lonely howl. Each sound tightened her nerves. In the dim moonlight, she forced down a piece of bread and some jerky, washing it down with gulps of creek water. The night stretched on her imagination, conjuring visions of Conrad's furious face, his men scouring the countryside for her tracks. She was desperate to reach some safe haven, perhaps a larger town with law enforcement that wouldn't be swayed by bribes or intimidation. But the nearest settlement was days away through rugged territory, and she had never traveled so deep into the mountains alone. Despite the terror, a fragile sense of hope glimmered. She was finally out from under Conrad's immediate reach. With her hand clenched around her mother's locket, she prayed that dawn would bring a clearer path forward. The battered bride from New York had fled her gilded trap. Now she had to find the will to survive the wilderness and the vengeance that would undoubtedly follow. The next morning dawned with a shimmering golden light across the pine needles. Evelyn rose stiff from an uneasy sleep on the hard ground. She fed Pearl a handful of oats, then packed her meager camp. Her plan was to skirt the edges of the mountain range, using game trails to stay hidden. By midday, the terrain steepened. She led Pearl on foot through rocky gorges, breathing in the rich scent of earth and pine. Each step forward was a small victory against Conrad's tyranny. At least for the moment, she was free. But fate had another twist in store. Sometime after noon, Evelyn heard the distant echo of hooves and men's voices. Fear spiked her pulse. She ducked behind an outcrop, tugging Pearl into the shadows. Cautiously, She peered down a narrow valley. There they were, Ezekiel Proctor, and two other men she recognized from Deadwood. She couldn't see Conrad, but dread churned her stomach. If Ezekiel was here, Conrad might be somewhere close, or perhaps Ezekiel had been dispatched to track her. The men paused at a fork in the valley, scanning the ground for tracks. Evelyn cursed inwardly. The horse's hooves might have left impressions in the soft earth. Her heart raced as she pressed herself flat against the rock. For a terrifying moment, Ezekiel's gaze swept the ridgeline. He muttered something to the others, then continued onward, taking the left fork. Evelyn dared not move until their voices faded into the distance. When she finally emerged, heart pounding, she knew it was only a matter of time before they found her trail. She had to move faster, push deeper into the mountains. A sense of betrayal mingled with despair. Had Conrad known she would flee here? Or perhaps Javier's warning wasn't enough to fully cover her tracks? Evelyn pushed herself and Pearl to the limit, climbing narrow trails that wound between towering pines and slabs of granite. The air grew thinner, cooler. By evening, the sky had taken on a rosy hue, and she found a small clearing near a brook to rest. She started a small, smokeless fire with dry pine needles trying to keep it hidden under the thick canopy. Sitting by the faint flames, she mulled over her situation. If Ezekiel and the others were already in the mountains, she might be safer heading toward a place like Fort Laramie, days away to the southwest. But that route was fraught with challenges, unforgiving terrain, potential conflicts with the Sioux, or even bandits. Sometime after midnight, she jolted awake to the sound of distant horse whinnies. In a surge of panic, she smothered her small fire with dirt and threw her blanket over Pearl's head to keep the horse quiet. The hoofbeats drew closer, accompanied by muffled voices. She caught fragments. Gallagher, tracks, somewhere up here. Her breath caught in her throat. She realized in that moment that they were determined to find her no matter how high or far she fled. Adrenaline coursed through her veins and she silently vowed, if they wanted to drag her back to that ranch, they would have to break her spirit first. And she refused to let them do that. At first light, with no time to linger, Evelyn broke camp. She pushed Pearl into a careful but urgent stride, higher into the mountains, though it meant venturing off the worn game trails into terrain largely unknown to her. The higher she went, the less likely Ezekiel and his men would find her quickly, but the more treacherous her journey became. She tried to keep track of her direction by the sun's arc, but the dense canopy and twisting ravines made navigation precarious. Around midday, she came upon a narrow ledge overlooking a steep canyon. The path was only wide enough for one horse at a time, with a dizzying drop into a river gorge below. Gripping Pearl's reins, Evelyn inched forward. Pebbles skittered off the ledge, bouncing down to the roaring waters beneath. She felt her stomach lurch with every slip of the horse's hooves. Halfway across, an unearthly shriek echoed from somewhere above. A stray eagle, perhaps, but it startled Pearl, who whinnied and danced nervously. Evelyn held her breath, guiding the mare with gentle whispers and firm hands. Step by careful step, they made it to safer ground on the other side. Yet her relief was short-lived. Not 30 minutes later, a rifle shot rang out, reverberating across the canyon. Then a second shot barked. Pearl froze, and Evelyn's heart thundered. She couldn't tell which direction the shots had come from, only that they sounded close. She dismounted, pressing herself and Pearl against a thicket of pines. A third shot echoed, followed by raucous shouting. Anxiety coiled in her gut. Were Ezekiel and his men firing at her? Or was it something else? Gingerly she crept forward on foot, to peer over a rocky embankment. Through the branches she saw 3 men. None of them looked like Ezekiel. They wore ragged clothes, unkempt beards, and had a wild look in their eyes. One was holding a rifle, pointing it at a figure dressed in buckskins. The figure's long hair and beaded moccasins marked him clearly as a Sioux man. Evelyn's pulse surged. She recalled Conrad's hateful words about the Sioux, but seeing one cornered by these men, she felt a surge of sympathy. The man's back was against a wall of stone, a small stream trickling at his feet. Blood stained his right shoulder. One of the ragged men shouted, "Drop your weapon, savage!" The Sioux man clutched a bow, but she could see his strength waning from the wound. Fearful of drawing attention, Evelyn stayed hidden. She had no weapon beyond a small pocket knife. 3 armed men stood before her, apparently intent on killing or capturing the Sioux man. Her heart hammered. If she remained hidden, the man would likely die. If she tried to intervene, would she make any difference at all? As one of the ragged men lifted his rifle to aim, Evelyn's mind flashed to all the cruelty she had endured and how she had so desperately wished for someone, anyone, to help. Steeling her nerves, she clutched the small knife and prayed it would be enough. With a burst of courage, she sprang from her hiding place, yelling at the top of her lungs. "Stop!" All 3 men whirled around their rifles, half raised in confusion. Evelyn's sudden appearance, hair, loose around her shoulders, startled them. "Don't shoot!" she shouted again, voice quivering but determined. One of the men narrowed his eyes. "Well, looky here," he drawled, stepping forward. "A lost little lady in these parts." 2 of them exchanged glances, and she felt their leering stares linger on her. She realized with a shudder that they might be as dangerous to her as they were to the wounded Sioux. Still, she had committed to this course. She couldn't back down now. "He's hurt," Evelyn said, pointing to the Sioux man, who was staring at her with equal parts bewilderment and distrust. "Leave him be. He's no threat to you." The man who appeared to be the leader, a wiry individual with a scraggly beard, sneered. "Ain't no threat. He's been tracking us all day, probably scouting for his tribe. We can't let him go." Evelyn drew a shaky breath. Then I'll take him with me. I'm lost. I don't mean any harm." She held up her empty hands, trying not to let her voice tremble. "Just let us leave." A rumble of laughter rose among the men. "You and what army's gonna make us the leader?" challenged. He lifted his rifle until it pointed directly at her. In that moment, Evelyn wondered if her life was about to end here on a lonely mountain slope. But luck, or perhaps providence, intervened. A noise from behind the men drew their attention. Suddenly, the wounded Sioux man seized the moment. He gritted his teeth, raised his bow, and fired an arrow so swiftly it was a blur. It struck one of the men in the leg, sending him reeling with a cry of pain. The leader swung his rifle around, but the Sioux warrior, despite his injury, lunged forward with a hunting knife. A melee of shouting, thrashing limbs and dust erupted. Amid the chaos, Evelyn dropped to the ground, scrambling behind a boulder to avoid stray bullets. She heard 2 shots, then a thud. The leader howled in pain. When the dust settled, Evelyn peered out. One man lay unconscious. The leader clutched his shoulder, and the third, with the arrow in his leg, hobbled in retreat. The Sioux warrior stood leaning against the rocky wall. A fresh streak of blood glistened on his torso, but his eyes blazed with fierce resolve. The leader, seeing the tables turned, stumbled backward. "This ain't over," he spat, then hurried to drag his wounded companion away. Come on, we'll get the others." The men retreated, leaving the Sioux man sagging from his wounds. Evelyn approached cautiously, heart still hammering. She offered him her canteen, and he accepted, wincing with every movement. Neither spoke the other's language well, if at all. With trembling hands, she pressed a clean cloth from her bag to his wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "Let me help," she said, softly. The Sioux warrior eyed her warily, but desperation forced him to allow her. She feared the men's promise to return with others. They didn't have much time. If he stayed here, he would die or be captured. So mustering her courage, Evelyn called Pearl from behind the trees and looked at the Sioux man. "We go," she said, pointing at the horse, then to the mountains. His expression was a mixture of pain and confusion, but after a moment, he gave the barest of nods. Together they mounted Pearl, the warrior nearly collapsing into her arms, and disappeared into the dense pines. It was an arduous ride, doubly so because the Sioux man struggled to stay upright. Evelyn guided Pearl as gently as possible through a twisting network of deer trails. Late afternoon light slanted through the boughs, casting shifting shadows on the forest floor. The man's breathing was labored, and she could see fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage at his side. At last they found a small, well-hidden grove near a creek. Evelyn helped him dismount. He stumbled, nearly falling, and she caught him under the arms. Through clenched teeth, he hissed in pain. She laid him on a soft patch of grass and quickly gathered sticks to build a small fire. In the flickering light, she examined his wounds more closely. A bullet grazed across his side, and an earlier gunshot wound in his shoulder that had only partially healed. She cleaned them as best she could with water from the creek, using strips of her own petticoat as bandages. He grimaced but didn't resist. When her makeshift nursing was done, she finally sat back, exhaustion crashing over her. The man studied her face, eyes reflecting a guarded gratitude. Tentatively, he spoke a single word, voice rough. "Wiyaka." She tilted her head, not understanding at first. He tapped his chest. "Wiyaka." Then he gestured to her, tilting his head in question. She realized he was giving his name. "Wiyaka," she repeated, offering a small smile. She then pointed to herself. "Evelyn." Wiyaka tried to say her name, but stumbled over the unfamiliar syllables. Lynn, he finally managed. Despite the pain etched in his features, he seemed determined to communicate. The night air grew cold, and a soft wind hummed through the pines. Evelyn added more wood to the fire and retrieved a strip of jerky from her saddlebag. She offered half to Wiyaka, who hesitated before accepting. They ate in tense silence, punctuated by his occasional wince. Her thoughts swirled. She recalled Conrad's hatred of the Sioux and how the men in Deadwood spat vile slurs. Yet here she was, tending to a wounded warrior who had risked his life to stand against men who would kill him on sight. "Thank you," she murmured, though she doubted he would understand. She mimed drawing a bow and pointed to him, then to herself, and pressed her palm to her chest in a gesture of gratitude. He nodded slowly. Then he mimed a horse's reins and pointed at her as if to ask, "Why are you here?" She sighed, realizing the complexity of explaining. In halting gestures and a few English words, she hoped he might know. She tried to convey that she fled a dangerous man, her husband, and now others were hunting her. Though communication was limited, Wiyaka's gaze softened with empathy. In the dim glow of the fire, they shared a fragile understanding. Both were outcasts in these mountains, hunted by ruthless men. A fleeting sense of kinship flickered between them, bridging the divide of language and culture. That night, Evelyn stayed awake, weaponless, aside from her small knife, her heart pounding at every snapping twig. She and Wiyaka were unlikely allies, but perhaps fate had given them this chance to survive together. Over the next couple of days, Evelyn and Wiyaka moved slowly through the mountains, pausing frequently to let him rest. Though his wounds were serious, he seemed to gain strength with each day. Occasionally he would slip into a restless sleep, whispering words in Sioux that Evelyn couldn't understand. She tried to offer what comfort she could, a cool cloth to his forehead, a reassuring hand on his arm. In moments of respite, Wiyaka taught her small snippets of his language. He would point to the sky and say, "Mapia," teaching her cloud. Then he'd gesture to the sun and say. She repeated the words, smiling at his patient corrections. He also showed her how to read the lay of the land, pointing out signs of deer tracks or indicating water sources by the shape of valleys. Their tentative bond grew stronger each time they worked together to secure food or find shelter. Evelyn used her sewing skills to craft a better bandage from her spare dress, while Wiyaka gathered healing herbs he recognized. He crushed them into a poultice, applying it to his wounds with careful concentration. On the third day, however, their fragile peace was shattered. While gathering water from a small waterfall, they heard the distant echo of gunshots once again. Wiyaka stiffened. He exchanged a look with Evelyn, and she knew immediately they were being tracked. They hurriedly packed their belongings and mounted Pearl, but their pursuers were closing in. The horse could only carry them so fast, especially in rugged terrain. They reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley, just as 3 riders came into view, Ezekiel Proctor and 2 of his henchmen. Evelyn's blood ran cold. From the vantage point, she saw Ezekiel scanning the ridge rifle in hand. He pointed toward the cluster of pines, where she and Wiyaka were hidden. "They gotta be up there," he shouted, voice echoing in the crisp air. Wiyaka motioned for Evelyn to follow him on foot. He led Pearl carefully behind a rock formation, where the horse would be less visible. Then he crouched low, bow in hand, arrow-knocked eyes narrowed in concentration. Evelyn crouched beside him, heart thumping so loudly she was sure the men would hear it. As Ezekiel and the 2 others approached, Wiyaka gestured for Evelyn to circle around a silent command. She understood as flank them, cause a distraction. She swallowed her fear and crept through the pines, reaching a spot behind the men. Just as she rose to throw a rock to distract them, her foot slipped on loose gravel, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling down the slope. "Over there," shouted one of the henchmen. They whipped around, rifles raised. Evelyn's blood pounded in her ears. She dived behind a boulder, just as a bullet whizzed past, striking the trunk of a nearby pine. Wiyaka unleashed an arrow, catching one man in the arm. A cry rang out. Chaos erupted. Ezekiel fired blindly into the trees, cursing. Wiyaka fired again, and the second henchman fell with a shout, dropping his weapon. But Ezekiel was quick reloading and sending a bullet that tore into Wiyaka's leg. The warrior staggered with a muffled groan, dropping to one knee. Before Ezekiel could finish him off, Evelyn leapt out, screaming, "Stop!" in a voice hoarse with desperation. She hurled herself at Ezekiel's rifle arm. The gun went off with a thunderous crack, the bullet ripping into the ground just inches from Wiyaka. Ezekiel spun and backhanded Evelyn with shocking force. She hit the ground hard, tasting blood in her mouth. Dizzy and in pain, she looked up to see him standing over her rifle butt, lifted like a club. That was when Wiyaka, bleeding and grimacing, seized an arrow from his quiver, and with a final burst of strength, drove it into Ezekiel's side. The man bellowed, dropping his rifle. He staggered, clutching the arrow shaft. Evelyn scrambled away as Wiaka slumped, clutching his wounded leg. Ezekiel fell to his knees, cursing at the sky before he collapsed unconscious, or worse. Breathing ragged, Evelyn crawled to Wiaka's side. His eyes fluttered, and he nodded faintly. 2 of their pursuers lay incapacitated. The 3rd had fled in the confusion. They were wounded, yes, but alive. The mountain air felt both savage and liberating. "We must go," Evelyn whispered, tears mixing with dust on her cheeks. Wiaka blinked in agreement. Even injured, they couldn't stay. Somewhere out there, Conrad was still a threat. And now, more than ever, they had to keep moving. The final leg of their escape was slow and harrowing. Wiaka could hardly walk without help, and Pearl struggled to carry both of them on narrow trails. Still, they pressed on, guided by Wiaka's instinct for survival and Evelyn's unwavering determination. They skirted around hidden valleys, moving southward toward rumored Sioux camps, where Wiaka hoped to find help. Along the way, Evelyn tended his wounds with fresh bandages. The rugged terrain tested their resilience to its limits, but neither would give up. At last, one misty dawn, they came upon a secluded meadow, dotted with teepees and a handful of grazing horses. Smoke curled from several cooking fires, and figures moved in the early light, tending to daily tasks. Wiaka's eyes brightened at the sight of his people, and he managed a wan smile at Evelyn. Cautious warriors approached, bows and rifles at the ready. Upon recognizing Wiaka, they rushed forward. Concerned voices and hurried gestures filled the air as they carefully lifted him off Pearl. An older man with lines of wisdom etched on his face clasped Wiaka's hand, and a woman who appeared to be a healer tended his wounds. Evelyn hovered uncertainly, unsure if she was welcome or seen as a threat. However, when Wiaka spoke her name, Eve Lin, and explained in halting English that she had saved his life, the warrior's expressions softened. Several women guided her to a teepee, offering food and a place to rest. Overwhelmed, Evelyn sank onto a blanket, tears of relief slipping down her cheeks. Days passed in a haze of recovery. The Sioux community treated Wiaka with herbal medicines, slowly drawing out the infection and stitching his injuries with practiced skill. Evelyn, too, was nursed back to health, her bruises and exhaustion gradually fading. She found herself in the surprising position of being protected by a people her husband had taught her to fear. The irony was not lost on her. During her stay, she learned that Wiaka was a respected scout who had been tracking suspicious strangers, prospectors, or outlaws on tribal land. He was wounded in an ambush, but his vow to defend his people never wavered. Evelyn also learned that tension was growing in the region because of gold discoveries, and many Sioux worried about further incursions by men like Conrad. As she grew stronger, she contemplated her next steps. She could not remain here indefinitely, nor did she wish to risk drawing Conrad's wrath upon the tribe. Yet she also felt a profound sense of gratitude for the kindness extended to her, an outsider. One cool morning, as she helped gather water at the stream, she heard distant hoofbeats. Anxiety pricked her senses. Emerging from the trees was a small group of cavalrymen, escorted by an older rancher in a dusty coat. Evelyn's heart pounded. Had Conrad found her? But as they drew closer, she recognized the rancher, James Allison, a respected figure in the Dakota Territory, known for mediating disputes between settlers and the Sioux. James dismounted and spoke calmly with the tribe's elders, offering supplies and forging peace. Through broken translations, Evelyn discerned that he had come to quell rumors of violence, worried that ranchers like Conrad Gallagher might provoke an all-out conflict. When James caught sight of Evelyn, battered and standing among the Sioux, He did a double take. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked gently. She gazed at him, tears welling up. Here was someone with enough influence to help her break free from Conrad's iron grip. If only she could speak the truth. And so on that day, under the vast Dakota sky, Evelyn found the courage to share her story with a man who might finally deliver her from the darkness that haunted her. With Wiyaka's blessing and the tribe's permission, Evelyn accompanied James Allison and his cavalry escort back toward the settlers' territory. Throughout the ride, she relayed her harrowing experiences, her arrival as a mail-order bride, Conrad's escalating cruelty, and her flight through the mountains. James listened intently, a mix of disbelief and sympathy etched into his weathered features. As they neared Deadwood, Evelyn's anxiety mounted. She recalled Conrad's network of dangerous associates, including Silas Merton and Ezekiel Proctor, who might still be alive and vengeful. Yet James assured her that he would personally vouch for her safety and present her case to the local authorities, including Sheriff Seth Bullock, a man of growing reputation in Deadwood. Upon arriving in town, James escorted Evelyn to the sheriff's office. The bustling main street thrummed with activity prospectors, lugging sacks of ore gamblers, staggering out of saloons and wagons creaking under the weight of goods. Evelyn's heart pounded as she walked past the White Buffalo Saloon, recalling her ill-fated wedding dinner. Sheriff Bullock was a tall man with a steely gaze and a mustache that accentuated his stern expression. He sat behind a cluttered wooden desk, listening quietly as Evelyn recounted everything she had been through, including the times Conrad struck her and threatened her life. James corroborated her story, adding that he had been aware of rumors regarding Conrad's involvement with illegal gold claims and intimidation tactics. "We'll need proof," the sheriff said, folding his arms. "Statements from you, from the ranch hands, from anyone who's seen what he's done. The law's tenuous here, but if we gather enough evidence, I can arrest him." Evelyn nodded, hands trembling. "Javier?" "Mason," she murmured. "They might help." They saw the bruises. The sheriff stood, tipping his hat. "We'll find them. In the meantime, you'll stay where Conrad can't get to you." "James, can you provide lodging?" James nodded. "I have a small cabin on my ranch. She'll be safe there." Relief warred with fear inside Evelyn. Safe at least for now. But the idea of confronting Conrad in a court of law, such as it was in Deadwood, made her stomach churn. She wanted to run away entirely, leave the Dakota Territory forever. But she also knew that men like Conrad would continue to terrorize others if no one stood up to them. Over the next few days, Evelyn stayed at James's cabin. Javier and Mason, summoned by Sheriff Bullock, confirmed her account, describing Conrad's violence and his hush-hush dealings with outlaws. That was enough to secure a warrant for Conrad's arrest. The sheriff and a small posse rode out to the Gallagher ranch, determined to bring him in. But when they arrived, Conrad was nowhere to be found. The ranch was almost deserted, the bunkhouse empty. A single note pinned to the door read, "Tell your sheriff to stay out of my affairs, or blood will spill." It was signed with a crudely drawn G. Evelyn's blood turned to ice when she heard the news. Conrad was on the run, and he would surely blame her for his downfall. As James Allison said grimly, "He's wounded, cornered, and dangerous. We'll find him. But God help us if he finds you first." Days stretched into weeks. Evelyn remained under James Allison's protection. She helped around the ranch, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy. Yet each snap of a twig or far-off hoofbeat made her startle heart rattling in her chest. She knew Conrad was out there, an invisible storm on the horizon. Meanwhile, law and order in Deadwood remained tenuous at best. Sheriff Bullock and his deputies searched for Conrad, scouring mining camps, saloons, and stagecoach lines. Rumors floated in from traveling merchants that a man matching Conrad's description was drifting south, possibly attempting to leave the territory or regroup with allies. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind rolling hills, Evelyn was out in the pasture feeding James's horses. The air was cool and smelled of hay. She heard a faint noise that prickled her intuition, hoofbeats distant yet closing in. She called out to James, but he was in the barn, too far to hear. Stepping away from the corral, she peered down the dirt road leading to the ranch. A lone rider approached at a slow pace, slumped in the saddle. Her pulse hammered when she recognized the figure, Conrad Gallagher. He looked haggard with a bandage wrapped around his arm, clothes stained with dirt and blood, his eyes sunken and wild, fixed on her like a hawk spotting prey. She froze in terror. Conrad dismounted clumsily, nearly falling before he caught himself. He pulled a revolver from his holster, leveling it at Evelyn. "You thought you could ruin me," he rasped. "You and that meddling sheriff." Evelyn swallowed hard, hands shaking. She cast a glance at the barn, hoping James would emerge. Conrad's gaze followed hers, and he gave a twisted smirk. "You're alone, aren't you?" A cold wind swept across the pasture, rustling the tall grass. Evelyn tried to speak, her voice quavering. "Conrad, it's over. The sheriff has a warrant for you. You can't." He cut her off with a snarl. "Shut up. You and that tribe, you cost me everything. I had deals, fortunes lined up. Now I'm a hunted man because of you." She took a cautious step back, but he advanced, the revolver glinting menacingly in the fading light. Desperation churned in Evelyn's belly. She had no weapon, nothing but a pitchfork leaning against the corral fence. Suddenly a shot rang out from behind Conrad. James Allison stood at the barn door, rifle aimed. "Drop the gun, Gallagher," he shouted. "I won't warn you twice." Conrad whirled, firing wildly. The bullet whizzed past James, splintering the wooden door. James squeezed the trigger, and his rifle cracked. Conrad stumbled, a red stain blossoming on his shoulder. He screamed in pain, but the adrenaline of hatred still fueled him. Turning back to Evelyn, he fired again. Time seemed to slow. She dove sideways, feeling the searing heat of the bullet graze past her arm. Pain flared, but she managed to scramble behind a water trough. Conrad limped forward, eyes maddened with vengeance. James fired another round this time, hitting Conrad square in the chest. The cruel husband gasped, dropping the revolver. He staggered, blood flecking his lips. Collapsing to the ground, he locked eyes with Evelyn one final time. A twisted blend of rage and disbelief etched his features. Then, with a rattling breath, he went still. Evelyn pressed a shaking hand to the wound on her arm, adrenaline surging through her. She scrambled to her feet. James rushed to her side, his rifle still smoking. "You're hit," he said, voice tight with concern. She stared at Conrad's lifeless body, torn between shock and a surge of profound relief. At last, the man who had wreaked such havoc was no longer a threat, and she was free. In the days after the shootout, Evelyn's wound was treated by Dr. Theodore Glenn Deadwood's trusted physician. Though the sting of Conrad's final glare still haunted her, relief began to settle in. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Sheriff Bullock arrived with his deputies soon after. After examining the scene and taking statements, he ruled that James Allison had acted justly in Evelyn's defense. No charges were filed. With Conrad gone, Evelyn was free from fear, from control, from the shadows of her past. The Gallagher ranch went into legal limbo, and Evelyn, wanting no ties to that cursed place, sold off the remaining horses, keeping Pearl her faithful companion. The money was modest, but it was hers. Javier found work on nearby ranches. Young Mason started apprenticing in town, far from the violence he had known. Wiaka recovered fully. Through James Allison's help, early peace talks began between the Sioux and local settlers, fragile though they were. Wiaka sent a message inviting Evelyn to visit his camp, a sign of gratitude and respect. One morning, Evelyn stood outside James's cabin, the cool mountain wind brushing her face. She looked to the horizon and realized she finally had choices. She could return east, move further west, or help mediate between cultures. The possibilities stretched out like the open plains. Her thoughts drifted back to the ad that started it all, a mail-order bride ad pinned to a New York lamppost. That choice, reckless as it had been, had forged the steel of her spirit. The pain, the escape, the courage to fight back all had brought her here. The mountains no longer felt like prison walls, but like sentinels watching over her rebirth. Tomorrow, she would pack her bag, mount Pearl, and ride not out of fear, but forward into the life she chose for herself. The wild frontier tested Evelyn McAllister in every way, her faith, her fortitude, and her very will to survive. From the desperation of a mail-order bride to the terror of an abusive husband's pursuit, she braved impossible odds. Yet amid the rugged mountains, she found unlooked-for kindness in a Sioux warrior's courage, and in the empathy of ranch hands and honest townsfolk who risked their own safety to protect her. In the end, the West's stark beauty mirrored Evelyn's own transformation. Out of hardship rose a stronger, more resolute spirit. If this tale of danger, resilience, and hope captured your heart, please consider supporting us. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you stories that celebrate the unyielding human spirit. Your engagement helps us reach more listeners, fueling our passion for delivering timeless tales of courage and survival in the American frontier and beyond. Thank you for tuning in.